Is it fair to grade homework lower if it's turned in late? Is there a cycle of violence and moral equivalency between Hamas and Israel? Is the anti-war Republican movement legitimate? We tackle these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through our feeds on social media and we find the most interesting takes, both good and bad, and we talk about what makes them so interesting and take them apart if we need to. My name is Donald and I'm here with my co-host Britt. And before we get started, just a reminder to follow us on socials. You can follow us on Instagram at Good Take, Bad Take Pod and Twitter and YouTube at Good Bad Take Pod. Make sure to like and subscribe and leave us a review. Without further ado, we'll get into our first take. So this take reads, if a student turns his homework in a day late and gets docked 50% on his score as a penalty, then what he's being graded on is not competence, but compliance. What do you make of this take?
Yeah, so, I mean, for those of you that have listened to the show for a long time, you know that I am a homeschooler, and Donnie was as well for a while. So my perspective on this is obviously, colored by that life experience. But I totally agree with this. Like, this is a very good take. And I think it kind of speaks to the overall public school system. And we've talked about it in previous episodes, but our public school system is modeled on the Prussian public school philosophy, which is we wanted to create, or the Prussians wanted to create obedient factory workers, essentially a good, obedient, subservient, population that would do all the work that they were told to do. And so everything that's modeled from, the way the chairs are set up in the classroom with a teacher at the front and everyone in the same row to, you change classrooms at the ring of a bell. All of those things are meant to create compliance, to create obedience. And in some kids and in some people, that's actually really good. Like, that type of structure is good and conducive to learning, but it's only a really small segment of them. And I mean, this is evidence of it, right? In that some people will learn differently. Maybe they need to take a little bit longer to do an assignment or to learn something. And if the overall goal is higher competency, which is what we should all strive for, then people should be able to learn somewhat at their own pace, right? And if they aren't learning at the pace of the entire class, like, maybe it means that there's something wrong with how it's being taught. Maybe there's something personally going wrong, but it's a signal that there's something wrong that needs to be corrected. And so this whole system of like homework and like, I saw other takes kind of on this, I think commenting on this this Twitter post saying like, hey, if you can't get the homework done in the 8 hours that a kid is at school, then like, what is actually being taught? Like, you're not actually using the time well. And so it's more of a signal that like the time at school is not being used well. When I was homeschooled, just for people to get a perspective on, like, I graduated college, had a pretty good GPA, got a job, all this stuff. But like, my homeschooling experience was one day with other kids for 3 hours. So I spent 3 hours in a classroom with other kids at a co-op being taught. And then the rest of the time was kind of like free range for me to do the assignments that I had, write whatever papers I had in the amount of time that I could get done within that, that week period. And I turned out fine. And I know a lot of other people turn out fine because homeschooling and, alternative schooling caters education to the student, not to some sort of rule set and try to force them into that. And like this guy is saying, that the entire education system, all the way down to how homework is graded, is about compliance, not about actually making kids smarter and better.
Yeah, I struggle a little bit with the specifics on this, and so I would say this is a good take with a tiny asterisk, which is to say, I think that there are specific instances where using a metric like the lateness of something isn't a bad incentive system, in the sense that I wouldn't say it's fair to say if your homework's a day late, 50%. That seems punitive. It seems like it is, again, grading on compliance, not competence. But I think there's also something where you can say, like, hey, look, if you're turning in your homework late more than like 3 or 4 times,
sure,
and this is a recurring problem, then we're going to have to dock your grade, because that's the only other incentive. And the reason why I think that that's important is because school is not just about necessarily learning this specific subject. It's also supposed to teach you just in general how the world operates and how to get on in the world. And, sometimes it's a matter of you can do your job when you like, do the job, get the objective done, do it well, that's fine. But there are also things where having a deadline and having things done in a time frame is a skill set you need to learn, because there are times when you do need. I mean, if you just think about the agriculture, industry, like you don't get to argue with nature. When the seasons turn, the seasons turn. And so there are certain aspects where that is, there is benefit to teaching that. That being said, the way that schools have this enforced as it currently stands is ridiculous. And I think this is true both in public school and in even private universities and just the college culture, where they have like attendance being part of your grade. Attendance being part of your grade is crazy to me because, again, that's like you're paying for the class, you are absorbing the material, and in particular in colleges, that's when you're going to have the most freedom to have like the textbook on your own that you're supposed to be studying. Usually you'd have to write papers or produce some kind of product for the class. And so to me, it's like if you're learning all those things and you're not attending the class, well, you're probably ingesting the information and doing the things you need to do without whatever class time that is, and you're making that choice. That to me is 100% more of a like, why are you grading on attendance there? Like, I also get that there are times in life when you have to show up for something, and that's true. But I also think that a system where that is, again, more punitive than not, it seems like you are, again, grading on compliance, not competence. So I would say that as a rule, this is absolutely correct. There can be exceptions, and I'm not against the idea of having some kind of rule structure for a classroom to say, hey, you know what? If you're habitually doing this, if you're, it's less about, things being not molding to compliance and more about maybe something going on there. But I also do like your point about homework and the idea that the way that it's assigned is kind of ridiculous, and that they're saying, hey, here's 8 hours of a kid's day that we can't teach everything we need to teach them in. So here's more things to do when you're on your own free time. And the fact that it gets even creepier when you just think about that's the state, compelling your child to do specific things within his or her own home. That's just kind of a creepy way when you think about it that way too.
I like that you brought up private university, because I do remember like the attendance policies and thinking like, man, I'm paying $30,000 for this. Like, I should be able to consume it or not consume it, right? And yes, you do have to, like, part of that is the certification. But like, if I can be certified and demonstrate my competence without attending, like, great. That should be all that matters. And it reminded me, I had this one professor, and she was huge on like APA formatting for paper writing. So huge that like she would not grade your paper if you didn't have it in the proper formatting. And I'm not saying that there's something specifically wrong with that, because it's like, okay, proper formatting helps communicate ideas. It makes sure that there's some sort of standardization so that professors can, do things properly. But she didn't actually have that wasn't the reason for it. Her reason for why you wanted to be APA formatted is because it's like, well, if you want to go in to get a doctorate, they're going to force you to do it this way. So that's why we have to do it. It's like, that's not a good reason to force kids to do it. And I don't think she was actually like, I don't think her APA formatting for like these 5-page papers, like, actually contributed to her being able to grade them faster, right? And so it was purely like some sort of compliance was forced upon her when she was doing her doctorate. And then now she was like, well, I'm going to force it upon, other people. And you see this in lots of other, I mean, this is just human nature in general. It happens all the time. But like like, we should be, when kids are the most malleable, when they're the most inquisitive, when they are the most curious about how the world works, instead of, forcing compliance and rule following and making sure they're always doing this and that at the expense of those things, like, we should be encouraging exploration, encouraging a little bit more freedom. They're going to have their whole lives to be compliant, because like you're saying, the real world does force you to do that in some way. Now's the time to learn like how you can kind of push those boundaries and not push them. And when you can get smacked and when you don't get smacked by them, it's not the time to, be like, hey, like, you're gonna get a 0 on a paper because you turned it in 2 days late or something like that. And like you were saying, much more so for when it's the public school system or government schools mandating like whether your kid is going to get the certification that's required for them to live life.
Yep, absolutely right. Okay, our next take is a comic, and it was important that I present who shared this too, because that's what I think makes this really funny. So the other 98%, which is a Facebook page, a group that's stemmed out of the we are the 1% kind of Occupy Wall Street movement, and they just kind of are, I don't know, that sort of cringy left group that is like left, but they claim to be centrists, but really they're just left. And anyway, they they share this comic of a wolf in the midst of a schoolroom filled with pigs and sheep and a chicken and a goat, and in the background looks like Red Riding Hood maybe, and he's holding up a book, in the library of the school library, and he says, "I don't want my kids reading books that make them feel bad about being big and bad." So what are your thoughts on this? Just first impression, kind of
I
a
mean, I just love that the school board is sheep. Like that's like such a funny. Like they obviously overlooked that. I don't know why they
or
chose
maybe they
that.
did. Maybe they didn't. Who knows?
Yeah. I don't know. I see. One of the things that's really interesting about this entire, I mean, what they're trying to argue, I am assuming, is like I think it's in Florida. They banned certain books about critical race theory, which basically teach that inerrant whiteness or whiteness creates an inerrant level of privilege. That means you must atone for the sins of not even your ancestors, but other people that shared your skin color. So you might be an Irish person that their family, your family migrated over here in the 1940s, never owned a slave, never participated in anything like that. In fact, probably actually were on the receiving end when your family, your ancestors were living in England. But you have to atone for the sins of people in the 1860s that you never met, you never knew, you probably don't even know any of their descendants. Simply because you share the same skin color or the perceived same skin color as they did. Which is absolutely ridiculous. It's not actually based on merit or anything like that. And we've talked about reparations before on this podcast, and I think that if someone could point to another person and say, "Hey, look, I have this quantifiable loss that your ancestor perpetrated, and I can demonstrate it and prove it and show it over time," I think that there's a reasonable like claim to be made that like, hey, maybe that some restitution should be made for that. The problem is that if you continue to go further and further back, eventually everyone owes everyone something at some point. So that even at that level, if you can point to it and show it, like you might very well end up owing someone else something at some point, because it turns out that as humans, all of our ancestors did something really bad to someone else at some point in our history. And I think the thing that really destroys this meme, which makes it terrible, is that these kids are not wolves yet, right? Like everyone has, they haven't eaten another animal or anything like that. And the line that, I don't want them reading a book that makes them feel bad about being big and bad. They're literally saying, regardless of their content of their character, the content of their actions, their history, just because they are a certain skin color, they are big and bad. That sounds like racism to me.
Yeah, absolutely right. All of your reasons are completely accurate, and I agree. The thing that struck me when I first saw this was I didn't see who posted it. And I kind of without, I think I'd maybe like woke up or I was a little tired. I was just kind of scrolling. I was like, are they making a joke about like trans predators here? That was my first thought, was like them being mad about the drag queen story hour kind of stuff, or like the children's books that are forcing the LGBTQ agenda down their throat. That was the first thing that struck me, and so I was like, oh, this isn't a good meme. This isn't making a good point, because what they are assuming in here. One, I think the important thing that you pointed out is that they're presuming the end argument conclusion, which is that they are already bad, right? That they are already inherently bad and have done these bad things. But also, it's not a good articulation of a viewpoint, because the whole issue with schools and book bannings and all that is that it's all mandatory compliance. And when you have issues like, you know, sexual identity or critical race theory, you have these really heated issues. The problem is that there shouldn't be any of this kind of mandatory reading one way or the other, and they shouldn't be forcing people to read one thing or the other that is going to inherently cast someone in that light. And so when it comes to like the trans movement, like I don't want my kids reading books that are telling them that, if you don't believe that every gender exists and that every relationship is completely equal, then you're a bigoted psychopath. I don't want those books being forced down and being promoted by schools. Similarly, I also don't want books that are telling kids that they're inherently predators and racists. Um, the funny thing is the people who cry so loudly for we can't have a Bible scene in a school, let alone prayers for the school and being taught, which I don't want mandatory biblical teaching classes either, but I wouldn't be mad if we allowed them to read that. But the people who protest, like, we don't even want this on campus, they're saying, no, you have to buy into this other religion, this other ideology. And so they're kind of trying to make fun of this person who's like, look, this person's being so unreasonable because they want to ban these books. But you just need to flip the script a little bit and say, no, we're not the weird ones for not wanting our kids to be force fed this. You're the weird ones who's saying every kid must have this religion forced down their throat, whether or not it's true, because it's absolutely not. So I think this was a bad meme because it's not arguing its points effectively. It's not doing it winsomely. It's presuming the end case. So it's not a meme that helps illuminate anything. It's a meme that tries to take a shortcut and get to the end conclusion and just make that the assumption of the whole thing. It'd be like, in the basic sense, it's kind of a tautological meme, right? It's saying, look, this thing is bad and the bad people want it banned. Like that's all the meme is kind of saying. And that's just tautological to say this thing that is bad. The bad people want it banned because they're bad. That's all it is. And it's not clever. It's not specific to the scenario. And I don't know. It feels like it could go a million ways. When you're showing a wolf in a kid's library, the first thing I just think of is Drag Queen Story Hour, which is just funny to me, just as far as visuals go. And I think a lot of people also did, because there were a lot of comments that were like, this maybe could go both ways, actually. About that.
That's funny. I didn't perceive it that way. I was trying to just read through it.
Yeah.
But I can see, because the sheep and the pigs and all that,
Yeah. Well, you were reading it and analyzing. I just saw the visual, and I'm just saying, when I see a wolf in a library setting, I'm like, oh, what kind of wolves have been in libraries recently?
Yeah, that's very fair.
Yeah. Anyway, all right, moving on. All right, this, of course, is going to be takes on the horrific attack in Israel from Hamas. It was a devastating attack. Lots of terrible violence that happened. Unequivocally evil. That is true. The response and the context surrounding it, however, are maybe not quite as simple as a lot of people would have you believe. So let's look at these takes and let's break them down. First comes from Ben Shapiro, who says, "Hate evil, you who love the Lord." Psalms 97. "We have a moral duty to hate perpetrators of rape, kidnappers of children, mass murderers of innocents. There is no moral equivalence. There is no cycle of violence. Hamas is the face of evil." And Adam Schiff tweets, "Israel is experiencing its own 9/11. There is no both sides to this attack. Hamas is a terrorist group mass murdering hundreds of innocent Israelis and taking women and children hostage. The U.S. must stand ready to provide Israel with the support it needs to defend itself, including humanitarian aid and funding for the Iron Dome." All right, let's break it down.
Oh,
it's
man.
sticky.
Well, when Ben Shapiro and Adam Schiff agree that whatever they're agreeing on is probably not going to be correct, because the only time both sides of the aisle unanimously agree on something is when they're trying to do something very, very awful. The biggest issue I take with both of these takes is this myth that there is no cycle of violence. There is no both sides to this. And it's like, well, actually, and I know Ben Shapiro knows about this, and I don't know if Adam Schiff knows about this, but Hamas was created and funded by Israel. Like, literally, when they were trying to break up the PLO, they literally funded Hamas and tried to stir up the radicalism in that group, simply because they wanted to kind of create some chaos so they could maneuver and kind of big brain it, essentially. And then once they had sufficiently funded them, Hamas had become powerful enough, the US went in and said, hey, we're going to spread democracy and we're going to have free elections in the Gaza Strip. And surprise, surprise, Hamas got elected. So Hamas, if we want to talk about both sides of it, it's like, well, if the parties that touch both sides of this is the US and the Israelis. Hamas only exists because of the Israelis and because of the US. So that's kind of a crucial little detail that maybe we should think about as we move forward. And I'm affected by emotionally affected by what's going on. We all see the videos. I feel awful. That's an awful visual to see, a lot of these women being hurt and families being murdered and slaughtered by Hamas. And it's definitely evil. I'm not going to deny that what's going on is awful. But as we proceed and as Israel proceeds, like maybe they should think about all the things that occurred before this that have led to this moment. And unfortunately, this is kind of the same 9/11 thing. It's like history started on 9/11. History started in the Gaza Strip 3 days ago. It's like, no, there's actually a lot more that occurred behind that. It's not just because these people are, and some of them are evil, but there are reasons that you can get massive amounts of men to do awful actions. And usually it's due to bitterness. It's due to some sort of cycle of violence. And I remember seeing this chart on Twitter of just the amount of dead bodies on either side over the past 15 years. And so, yeah, there's many dead bodies on the Palestinian side, and there are many dead bodies on the Israeli side, but they're significantly less. And so you could see, regardless of whether the perception is correct or accurate, or whether you could justify it with words and rhetoric, like someone's mother, someone's father, someone's brother, someone's sister, daughter, son has been killed by one side or the other. And that obviously it creates anger. The anger that we're seeing today from the Israelis is also being felt by the Palestinians. It just was felt maybe a year ago, 10 years ago, or whenever, and that eventually grows. And so with that in mind, maybe we should proceed differently than just turning the Gaza Strip into a parking lot, as all these people are advocating for.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple key things from these takes that are interesting to note. The first is there is no moral equivalence, there is no cycle of violence. Like you pointed out, there is a cycle of violence. And I think what's tricky here is Ben Shapiro puts those in the same sentence. I don't think there's actually moral equivalence. Like, I don't think it's like, oh, both sides are equally bad. I think you can recognize both sides have done bad things, and the brutality of Hamas's attack here is
Worse.
like is worse, right? It's like just it's in a different kind of category. Now, is there a cycle of violence? Well, yes. Like literally, yes. You've pointed that out. There doesn't have to be moral equivalence for there to be a cycle of violence. And so looping those things together makes you dismiss the whole thing. Because if you look at Hamas and then you look at Israel and you say, well, even if you recognize, and a lot of these people don't, but even if you recognize that what Israel has done and how they're treating Palestinians that are in their territories and things like that is not good. But if you look at the two, you're like, well, there's maybe second-class citizens here, but we're not like kidnapping women and children. So there's no moral equivalence. And therefore, then you reject, well, he said there's no moral equivalence, no cycle of violence. We'll just throw it out. It's like, no, there is a cycle of violence, even if there's not moral equivalence. It's like, if I throw a pebble at you and you come and sock me in the face, there's not moral equivalence, but there is a cycle of violence there, right? Because then you've punched me in the face, and then maybe I'll kick your shin, and then you like sucker punch me. Like there's a million things that can go in a cycle of violence there without there being moral equivalence. You can continue to provoke without it being equal retaliation. Now, because of that, the other thing is that's interesting is Adam Schiff says Israel is experiencing its own 9/11. There is no both sides to this attack. Again, two statements kind of lumped together when it's to say, well, actually, 9/11, there were both sides in a sense. Again, was there moral equivalence? No, not necessarily. Like, what happened on 9/11? Well, what happened on 9/11 was unmitigated evil, and to the people it affected, unprovoked, right? Like, unprovoked to the people in those towers. Absolutely atrocious evil. The U.S.'s meddling in foreign policy invited that kind of thing. It didn't justify it. And that's the thing that you will see from neocons everywhere. Even someone I like Kevin Gutzman, was questioning Dave Smith on this, and it was just the most eye-rolling thing. He used the word justified because Dave Smith acknowledged that there was provocation or whatever for this kind of thing. It's like, no, provocation doesn't mean justification. Those are different things. Like, for instance, if I taunt you saying, hey, Britt, you look ugly, again, and you punch me in the face, I've provoked you, but I haven't justified you punching me, right? Again, different concepts, but people lump them all together. So Israel's experienced its own 9/11, no both sides. There is, but the important thing to take away is that there was a both sides, and that there was provocation. Like you said, the entire setup of Hamas was because they were trying to disrupt the PLO and created it. But the interesting thing is now, what did we learn in the wake from 9/11? We learned that the warmongers will use every opportunity to go above and beyond and to create ISIS. We're just going to create, Ben, be afraid, a cycle of violence if we continue with the same foreign policy. Now, here's the thing. If we lived in a world where I trusted the people in charge, and I thought that our elected leaders actually were in control, and somehow I trusted every single one of them to retaliate with no further proportionate response, there could be an argument I would buy that would say you need to respond to Hamas in a tight, non non-expansive way that only focuses on Hamas terrorists themselves to subdue that group. The problem is that's not the world we live in. We live in a world where there will be collateral damage, where you do literally create the cycle of violence, even by taking out Hamas, and they will go above and beyond, and they will use this for their own ends as they do every single time.
Yeah, I saw a comment. I think it was on Adam Schiff's post actually. Israel's experienced its own 9/11, which means that they're going to, have a disproportionate response that overreacts and makes everything a lot worse, just like we did in Afghanistan, which, like you were saying, is exactly what we did. We didn't actually even solve the problem, right? We cornered bin Laden in Tora Bora, and we didn't even catch him. So we went in, did all this nation building. We're there for 20 years and got nothing out of it. And ideally, that doesn't occur again here in Israel and the Gaza Strip. You said a lot of good things. I think the last thing I want to take apart is Adam Schiff's last sentence, which is that we must stand ready to provide Israel with the support it needs, including humanitarian aid and funding for the Iron Dome, as if we haven't given billions of dollars to the Iron Dome that didn't work, supposedly, during this attack. So we've given billions of dollars. Somehow the premier intelligence agency with the best borders, with the most funding for all of these different types of border control mechanisms, and the most at ready military in the world, was not able to detect that they were going to send different types of insurgents in and do this attack. And now there's been reports that the Israeli government knew about this 10 hours in advance and weren't able to do anything about it, which just further speaks to the inadequacy, even if there's no malice within that. We can't assign that. We need to be discerning. There's so much smoke in the air that we don't actually know what's going on. But even if there is no malice, like I was saying, the government is not, the Israeli government was not capable enough to stop this from occurring. They should also give you pause about whether they're capable about making the best decision moving forward to just flatten the entire Gaza Strip. I don't know if that's the right answer to this. I think it's kind of inevitable, and it's very sad because as much as Kurt Schlichter and some of these other neocons are advocating for, it's there's 4 million people in the Gaza Strip. Let's just say half of them are this awful Hamas group that would be happy to do all these awful things to people. There's still 2 million people that wouldn't want to do those things, that are there not of their own control, that are not able to go into Egypt, that are not able to go out into into the ocean and the sea to flee these things. And you're going to just let them be destroyed? That doesn't seem good either. So it's a very obviously tricky situation. And anyone that's saying that this is simple, turn Gaza into a parking lot is not thinking. They're just thinking with their, they're seeing red and they're wanting to go for it, which is just really sad. It's just a crazy thing because I kind of came to the libertarian and anti-war persuasion after all of the stuff was going on in Afghanistan and Iraq, and obviously there was still going on when I was there, but when I became a libertarian, but not when we were initially going to it, and everyone was kind of working everyone up to be angry about it. And it's just really crazy to see a lot of these people that I thought were really good on anti-war stuff now be just foaming at the mouth, willing to literally calling these people subhuman, semi-human, just destroy all of them. I specifically bring up Kurt Schlichter because he just has the absolute worst takes I've ever seen on this. Rejoicing that babies and people that have medical conditions no longer have power and are going to die. It's that is just an awful thing, no matter how you slice it. And not only is it morally awful to rejoice in those types of things, it's also from a utilitarian standpoint, if you're looking for a good outcome in the future, blowback is a real thing. And those type of positions, that type of posture towards the suffering of innocence is what fuels young men to join, organizations like Hamas to do types of terror like this.
Yeah, absolutely. To the point of, the 2 million, even if you split it 50-50, like you said, I mean, think about trying to tell any or most, I would say, Republicans who vote against a candidate, and we live in a democracy, and they're well, it's just ridiculous that California votes in all these blue policies, and it's well, you know what, actually a majority of Californians, they outnumber you in the United States, in your state. So because of that, you're actually going to be put under every single one of their bad policies. And they'd be like, what? That sucks. That's not fair. I didn't vote for that. One, yeah, democracy is not always that great. But two, that's also what we're doing, right? It's like Hamas does all these horrible things. And then there's 2 million innocent people who didn't do anything, if not more. And we're punishing them for the crimes of Hamas as well, which is just not a moral way to operate, I don't think. But also, speaking on sort of democracy, that's the other kind of crazy thing is that, the people who will want to flatten Hamas, they say the need for these democratic institutions overbroad in the sea, and how Israel is our democratic ally, and that's the reason why we have to specifically fund them and things. But the really weird thing is, once again, the twisting definition of democracy is in play here, because there's kind of two realities. If you're saying that Israel is our democratic partner, then one, there is one state, okay? There's only one state that Palestinians are living under, and it's Israel's. And so then Israel treats them as second-class, sub-tier humans and systems. They don't treat them well because there's only one state. They're their citizens, and they just literally have a non-democratic, caste system. Okay, that seems kind of weird and immoral. Okay, maybe there's a two-state solution. Maybe Palestine should be recognized and they're outside. Well, then Israel's just occupying another state, which is not a democratic democracy thing to do. It's again, we're invading your territory. So there's kind of like Israel's in a weird position if you're kind of trying to frame it as like our Western democratic ally, because either they're treating people second tier citizens, which they really are. You should look up a lot of the poor treatment of Palestinian people in Israel, which again, not justifying what Hamas did because of that, but is part of the provocation of these kinds of groups. And so either second tier citizens or you're occupying another land. So I don't know, it's very messy and complicated. And anyone who's trying to sell you something to say that it's simple and we just need to go support good guys over bad guys, they either don't know what they're talking about because they haven't looked into it deeper than the talking heads, or they are the talking heads that are trying to sell you on a war. And it's really tough because, like, you and I both came to libertarianism from conservative positions. And that's one of the things that, is kind of a core conservative principle that I still carry with me, is the right to self-defense. And so it's very difficult to be told this, this power over here that is generally friendly with your worldview, they're just enacting self-defense, and that's all there's to it. It's difficult to dig deeper into the realities and realize that there's more going on, but there is, and it's sad. And the problem is then that oftentimes people who do dig deeper, then they just go into the other side of the black and white scenario where they just want to justify anything Palestine has ever done and Palestinians do.
Yes.
And then that, of course, just reinforces the people who want to support Israel, because they're like, look, if you acknowledge that Israel's done anything wrong, you're a psychopath who wants kidnappings and murders. And that's not the position that you have to reside in. But I think it's the position a lot of people reside in, because we're going to look at this next take here. And Caitlin Johnstone tweets, "This has been a good reminder of why you shouldn't take the anti-war posturing of MAGA Republicans seriously. They're fully on board with a ton of warmongering agendas against Palestine, Iran, China, and socialist governments in Latin America. They're just anti-democrat wars." What do you make of this take?
It's a fantastic take. I almost, it stands on its own. I don't know if there's much to add to it. Like, it's really true that this pulls the people that were against the Ukrainian war, Kurt Schlichter and a lot of these other guys saying like, hey, we shouldn't be sending them billions of dollars, we shouldn't be sending them tanks, all this different stuff. They are the first to be foaming at the mouth for us to send all of the resources that we absolutely can. Even some of them advocating that we put actual boots on the ground or planes in the sky to do their pet war. So it just turns out that it's these wars and people's lives, innocent lives, are just a way for them to run cover for their political agendas. And then at the higher levels, it's for people to line their pocketbooks with the military industrial complex. And so at the end of the day, you follow the dollar and it all ends up in the military industrial complex's pocket, which gets distributed to various politicians, which then try to influence the media to, put certain types of thoughts out there that make people want to be foaming at the mouth. There's a reason why we're seeing all of these videos all the time on repeat, constantly in our feeds. And that's not, like I was saying earlier, like, I'm affected by them. I feel very sad and grieved and angry at these types of atrocities being done. But I also want to have discernment that, like, I'm not going to just, make a move or say that we need to flatten something simply because I've been emotionally worked up. And so it's kind of like I remember my dad telling me about how when the Nixon tapes were released, and he used to think that Henry Kissinger was just this awesome guy, and then he heard Kissinger saying, like, well, if we prolong the war in Vietnam for X amount of months, past the election season, war is good for your election, Mr. Nixon. So let's just keep prolonging it. And my dad was like, man, these guys are monsters. These guys would literally be willing to trade American lives, young men's lives, and not to mention, the natives in Vietnam, their lives, just so that they can get elected and get a salary and have a little bit more power for a little bit longer. And so this really pulls the face mask off of all these people. They are warmongers that literally will sacrifice children and women and men, innocents, just to line their pocketbook and get a little bit more status and power.
Yeah, it's funny because when it comes in particular to the MAGA Republicans who've claimed all this, you kind of knew, and when they're all claiming to be anti-war, you knew because
I hoped.
Right. But we all kind of knew because, like, Donald Trump claimed to be very anti-war, and to his credit, he was more restrained than others. But then he dropped the bomb in Syria, and you're like, okay, so this is I never thought Donald Trump was an ideological person to begin with, and now we really know this is the case, and it's one of those things where I don't regret supporting Republic. Well, I guess it depends on the terms we're talking about here, but broadly speaking, I don't regret supporting, in general, Republicans who campaigned on anti-war issues. Now, when you're saying, in contrast to someone who's actually anti-war, or like like a libertarian or something, then maybe I would say that you definitely should be a lot more selective if there's a good, strong libertarian candidate. But I also think that, showing Republicans and Democrats when they are anti-war that's an issue we care about, and is an important facet of this terrible democratic system we're stuck under. Of course, they just can turn around and do what they like at the end of the day, and they'll, both candidates usually that are going to get elected are going to support the war either way. But I think it's still important to have a cultural movement towards anti-war as much as you can. So even if it is a temporary feeling, you can't invest all of your assets into that movement in the MAGA. If I was a really big anti-war guy, like as far as a industry, like a group or a movement kind of individual, investing all of your eggs into the MAGA basket would not be smart, because they are going to flip. But capitalizing on it and getting your message out there for the people who actually can be convinced is important. The funny thing is, though, this is, maybe life is just on like a 20-year cycle, because all this is the reversing of the anti-war Democrats who never were anti-war to begin with. And, growing up, we always heard about the anti-war Democrats. That was always a really big deal to hear about, was Democrats who were protesting, Bush's actions and their anti-war. And then the moment Obama got in, they were silent on things like Syria and others. And so they shut up real quick. They were always on board when it came to Democrat wars. Ukraine's an example of that. They were against they're just anti-Republican war Democrats or whatever. So all that being said, it just shows that the two parties are really not different. They operate in the same way. They don't run on ideological principles. They only run on what is politically expedient at the point. It's kind of one of the reasons why you should support good Republicans or good Democrats where they exist, but they're few and far between. Even if they claim to be more, very few are actually ideologically driven.
Yeah.
All right. Our last take here is going to be a response to, we'll kind of go over both takes here, but we're mainly critiquing the response to Redeemed Zoomer, who makes YouTube videos. He tweets, 3 reasons conservative Christians lose every modern culture battle. Number 1, libertarian attitude. Number 2, retreatist mindset. Number 3, being too nice. And then the response comes from someone who says, you're correct. Libertarian attitude is why. It certainly couldn't be a backlash of the whole 2000s supporting everything the regime supporting the regime in lockstep, leading to the erosion of institutions. Michael Knowles already tried this argument, and Dave Smith tore it apart in 30 minutes. All right, so we'll critique the response, but both are up for grabs here.
The response is awesome. The list of reasons is not very good, and to kind of steal from Dave Smith of his critique of Michael Knowles, and to expand upon what this guy is responding to, libertarians have been warning conservatives for literally decades that, hey, maybe you shouldn't do the Patriot Act. That's going to be, while it suits you right now, it's going to be turned around and used against you at some point. Maybe the principle should be liberty and freedom, not surveillance and tyranny. And conservatives pushed ahead with that regardless. And lo and behold, right, 2020 rolls around, Biden comes into control. And now the deep state, even while Trump was in control, the deep state leverages the Patriot Act and the various infrastructures and surveillance state that was set up with it to now go after conservatives. They can't solve many homicide cases. I think it's like 30% of homicide cases are actually ever solved, but they can pick out people in a crowd on January 6th and go arrest them and throw them in jail for decades. This huge government that was built up, that libertarians were telling conservatives, hey, don't do that, has now been turned around, and now we see the actual results of it. It wasn't good back when the conservatives were advocating for it, and it's certainly not good now that it's been turned around on them. And so, the culture battle was actually lost using or I guess it was won by the progressives using the infrastructure and tools that conservatives set up at the behest, not at the behest, but in lieu of and regardless of libertarians saying, hey, don't do that. And so maybe if conservatives had a little bit more of a libertarian mindset and actually conserve something, conserve their principles of 20 years ago and actually fought for it, then we'd be in a better position today. But turns out that they didn't, and now they are just defending. Like every libertarian says, conservatives are just liberals driving the speed limit.
Yeah, I agree. I think his other aspects are the other things he lists as his reasons are not wrong. I think, for instance, the idea of a retreatist mindset is a very big problem in the church in many ways, because there are difficult questions, and that's true, but of just life, right? There are different, the idea, like one of the biggest problems that Christianity confronts is the problem of pain, right? How can there be a loving God if pain exists in the world? That's known as theodicy. But of course, that's not just a one-sided, only Christians have to answer that. Because if you believe, in fact, that pain is wrong, first of all, you have to define why. You have to tell me why there are things that are and aren't wrong. And then you have to define what that standard is and how you come to that standard, and then why pain violates that standard. And so the problem is, Christians have been presented with, well, if there's a loving God, why is there pain? And instead of engaging with the question, they've run from it because they don't want to deal with it. And they say, well, God works in mysterious ways. And they never say, okay, yeah, that's a tough question. Let's talk about this. But you also have to recognize that you have to operate from a worldview as well. You can't just question mine without presenting your own. And there are other things too, like traditional marriage. We've in the culture, we were told, and this is to his point number 3, just be nice. Just be nice to and love your neighbors. And it's like, yes, but part of loving your neighbors is not being nice sometimes. It's being abrupt. It's being truth-telling when it's uncomfortable. Those things aren't always nice, but they are loving. And the problem is, with like marriage, we were told just tolerate, just don't challenge them, don't question them. They'll live their own life, but that's fine. And so that now, when it's being pushed on your children and it's being pushed down your throat, the church has no response because they haven't been telling people how to actively evangelize in this area and engage. So those things are correct. But the libertarian attitude is just so far removed from those things, because the libertarian mindset isn't live and let live, period. The libertarian mindset is don't use force against other people. But that doesn't mean not engage with the culture. That doesn't mean sit every battle out. And, it basically means, don't force people one way or the other to do things that you prefer. And I think that this response nails it, in that, the libertarian attitude wouldn't have, in fact, done so much more to preserve what the Christian church wants in a culture, because the antithesis of a libertarian attitude has ended up having our movement co-opted by these institutions that have degraded the moral foundations. And so when you sort of surrender your movement as the church to a politically right group and a persuasion of power, the problem is you end up hitching your saddle to things that will erode it. You kind of, as C.S. Lewis put, you wrap your cross in a flag, and that becomes the main issue over the cross. And what I would say is the flag kind of brings the cross down, And so I think it's like talking about libertarian attitude. Well, the libertarian attitude within the church, it doesn't mean that you can't be earnest and strong in your convictions. It means that you can't force other people to believe what you believe through, again, through violence, which is never going to work anyway. So I don't know. I'd be curious to know what Redeemed Zoomer means by libertarian attitude, because I think you could take it several ways.
Sure.
But regardless, I think Brandon's response here is excellent.
And we've talked about Michael Knowles, like his view on all this before. And what's really unfortunate is once you boil down their arguments for one policy or position or another, it really just boils down to, well, I think this is right, and I think I can use violence to enforce it upon someone else. And Michael Knowles and is very similar to what's going on, like in Israel, just sick of whatever's going on. So, let's just bulldoze it. Like Michael Knowles does the proverbial, let's just go scorched earth and let's just use the power. Let's wield the power that we get. Because when we don't wield power, like we get these bad outcomes. It's like, well, you have not realized that it's not just. It's kind of like who is it? Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, when Boromir's like, oh, well, why don't we use this against the enemy? And Aragorn's like, you cannot wield it. Like, none of us can. This power is not meant to be held by any single man. It will actually destroy you. And so conservatives fail to realize is that they have wielded the power at some point. And look at where it got us. It got us to this surveillance state. It got us to, like this guy was saying, the erosion of our institutions and them being captured. And the solution to this problem was not more of what got us here in the first place.
Absolutely right. All right. With that, I think that's the show. Thanks so much for listening. Make sure to give us a like and a share if you found this enjoyable, and we'll catch you on the next one. Take care.